At this point, I'd like to welcome in Chase Martin. He's the president of August Strategy Group. And as has been alluded to a few times today, healthcare spending in America is soaring. It's gobbling up family budgets, state budgets, and the federal budget. And with all the money that's being spent on healthcare, it's pretty important for us to understand where the waste is in the system and how fraud in particular is detected and prevented or not many times. This is an interesting topic that doesn't receive near enough attention, especially given that a fifth of our economy is spent on healthcare. So we're happy to have Chase here to talk about fraud and waste in the American healthcare system. He's an attorney who previously served as the legal and policy advisor for the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, where he worked on strengthening the integrity of the state's Medicaid system and fought fraud within Medicaid and other welfare programs. Since that time, he's organized and led NGOs and nonprofits to influence public policy relating to healthcare, energy, and telecommunications across the US, Europe, and Latin America. Chase, thanks for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate you having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Like you said, I'm Chase Martin. I'm the president of August Strategy Group. My firm is a government affairs consulting firm that takes our clients' conservative policy ideas and helps turn them into law across the country. Now, as Scott said, I've spent most of my career working to strengthen program integrity at the state and federal level, some international work, but a lot of that was around healthcare organization and political organizing, really teaching people how to get involved in politics around healthcare topics. But I'm actually going to jump back to the Stone Age a little bit into where my career started and why this is an important path and an important area for everyone to focus on. So I started actually working as an intern for Senator Olympia J. Snowe, who's from Maine, like I am, working out of her Portland office. Now, I had some very serious responsibilities, like answering the phone, getting mail from constituents and logging them into the system, and getting my boss breakfast. But overwhelmingly, something that jumped out at me was that the calls from the constituents revolved around healthcare and Social Security benefits. But those two things, I didn't really understand that well, but I knew I wanted to learn more because it was something at the forefront of every single interaction we had with constituents. Now, I continued on the path after school, went to law school, and thank you for OJS for the letter of recommendation. And I went to work on political campaigns. So throw a Y in chat if you worked on a political campaign and have some of that experience. So as you can, a couple people have worked on campaigns. Campaigns are wild experiences. You meet thousands of strangers that usually have one very important thing that they want to talk to the candidate about. And what that usually means is if you're a staffer, that means they're going to be talking to you about that issue as well. Many times it's about healthcare or their neighbor's healthcare. And I'm going to come back to this and why that's important. So after campaigns, as Scott had mentioned, I did join Governor LePage's Health and Human Services Department as the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor to the Commissioner, Mary Mayhew. Day one, I was tasked with being the commissioner's right-hand man for welfare fraud, something Governor LePage made a very huge priority during his campaign. And right away, we established an anti-fraud task force at the Department of Health and Human Services, which is strange, right? It's like, aren't we supposed to be giving people benefits? How are we supposed to be tackling this fraud? Well, it was a cross-department organization. There were members of the governor's staff, state police, Medicaid, welfare like SNAP, TANF, all of those programs kind of combined, got together. Well, after a few meetings, I was appointed as the acting director of the Fraud Investigation and Recovery Unit. Now, this is an interesting unit. It has 17 direct reports. There was no middle management. It was essentially all of these investigators reporting to one supervisor. And it was comprised of mostly former cops, but there were some bureaucrats and this that had been assigned to the unit, and they'd been there for over 20 years. Now, something I learned right away, because again, political operative, coming off the campaign, don't know too much about this space. I learned there's two major types of fraud committed against the state with regards to Medicaid: provider fraud and beneficiary fraud. I'm going to focus on both. So medical provider fraud is committed by doctors, nurses, administrators, or business owners that operate businesses that support healthcare and are receiving Medicaid reimbursements. Now, not every doctor or not every nurse or administrator is like committing some type of Medicaid fraud, but it's pretty easy to get sucked up into it once you start seeing the hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through people's fingers. If people have some of that intent in their body to start dipping into the till, so to speak, then it can get bad really quickly. Provider fraud is actually investigated by specialized accounting groups, usually called Medicaid Fraud Control Units. And they figure out fraud based on invoices, reimbursements, and attempting to discover discrepancies between the numbers. Now, again, I went to law school. I'm not really a big numbers guy. Math is a struggle for me, but these guys will figure it out. There is a talented group of folks that if the ones and zeros are out of place, they will find you. So it's usually just a matter of time, but greed doesn't care about that. Now, the overwhelmingly high amount of stolen dollars associated with fraud and from Medicaid are associated with provider fraud because the numbers can get so big so quickly. Now, this may surprise you, but one of the biggest fraudsters we found in the state of Maine was a translator business that billed millions in translation services that were never even provided. And I know that sounds a little odd. It's like, well, translation, what does that have to do with Medicaid? Like, is that healthcare? Is that providing someone services? Well, one thing you got to remember is that Medicaid serves every language, and you have to be able to provide the service. So providers are paid to ensure folks can sign up for benefits, access their benefits, and more. So to give you an example, if you walked into one of our offices in the state of Maine and you didn't speak any English, there's a chart, giant chart on the side of the cubicle usually that is in 60 plus languages. And you can just point to the one that's yours. And there's a number associated with it that the person will then call. And that service isn't a government service. That is a contractor that has an agreement with the state to start providing those services. And it's very expensive. So they had stole millions of dollars from the state of Maine. Another type of provider fraud that we run into that would shock people is non-emergency medical transportation. Now, this is a massive line item for the budget that essentially means rides to the doctor. And yeah, Josh made a good point. If you do have any questions, just please throw them in chat. I'm going to try to make time at the end for a few questions if you guys have them. So I mentioned provider fraud. The other side is beneficiary fraud. This is your standard type of fraud that most people recognize, and the fraud that was investigated by my fraud unit. So an applicant will come in and say, I want Medicaid, I want access. They start filling out the paperwork, etc. But they usually omit their assets or income or an accurate household composition in order to qualify for benefits. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get themselves or their family benefits when they shouldn't get it. Now, state governments break down those omissions into three types of categories. There's agency error, which the state agency must have made a mistake in order to grant you benefits, subjecting the state to penalties down the road if there's too many of those. But there's also unintentional household error. You know, you didn't realize your husband made $100,000 a year as an electrician and that he lived with you and that you had to report it. Sometimes that's an unintentional issue. And then there's IPVs, which are intentional program violations. And that is the category that is generally referred to as fraud by a lot of groups that collect data and report fraud in Medicaid. Now, the reason I mention all three of those is that where the act of obtaining benefits you're not entitled to or overpayments, it's subjective. The state agency gets to bucket you into which category fits best. Now, intentional program violations are difficult. You have to start an investigation. My unit, the fraud investigation recovery unit, would immediately create a case file, and they usually show up to your house and knock on the door. And they're going to talk to you about the issue. If you're not there, they then send you something that's called a 10-day letter. Now, these are all protocols and procedures that are required by federal and state law. So a 10-day letter is, hey, here's some questions about your account. You need to respond within 10 days or your benefits will cease. So that's actually where a lot of things stop. People get a scary letter like that and they go away. If it's an egregious situation where, let's say, for example, and this is a true story, you don't qualify for Medicaid and you've been using the ambulance service as a taxi every day for the last year, and you're ringing up about $40,000 to $50,000 a month in Medicaid charges illicitly to the program, they're not going to just send you a 10-day letter and let you off the hook. That is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, criminal element, and they're going to come after you. So let's talk about that fraud unit, though. What do they do? Who are they, et cetera? Why do they matter? So generally, these are 17 to 40 individuals that are located essentially in a closet in a state agency run by thousands of people, with their job is to give out welfare benefits. Their job is to sign people up for Medicaid, and these are the folks that they don't really get along with. They don't understand, like, why would you go prosecute people? Why are you hunting people down and trying to kick them off benefits, et cetera? Why are you trying to make obtaining benefits more difficult? Well, these are the folks that just have to show up every day and go after folks committing Medicaid fraud. So, like I said, you have some cops, former cops, people that have retired from their first job, and now they still want to keep investigating and earn a second pension, et cetera. And then you have the bureaucrats that have been there 20 years. And there was one woman who worked for me. Her name was Zelly. Zelly had been there for 22 years, and she refused to learn how to use a computer or a phone. And she would sit there at her desk playing, I think it was Candy Crush or something like that, every day. But it took me over a year to get her removed from the position, which is a very important position, because I need, when you're in a state and you only have 17 folks investigating hundreds of thousands, if not a million people, you need every asset available to you. Well, the Zellys of the world exist, but there are a lot of folks that work really hard and want to prosecute fraud. And thankfully, that was my experience. Now, remember when I was talking about campaigns and people talking to me about their neighbor's healthcare? One of the biggest areas for beneficiary healthcare fraud is household composition. My boyfriend/girlfriend doesn't live with me. My 4 kids live with me full time. I've got custody of them when they don't. We only find out about that type of fraud, which it is fraud, when a neighbor or a jilted lover or something like that picks up the phone and calls the fraud unit and reports them. So those were actually some of the conversations I heard on the campaign trail, and it carried all the way through. So I would get letters from the governor where essentially people were reporting in on their neighbors or folks that were committing welfare fraud. They'd send him letters, and I would just get these letters show up on my desk with a sticky note from the governor saying, prosecute this. And they're like, okay, here we go. And it sounds really difficult, but when you're trying to run a program that gives people healthcare benefits, and you're trying to take care of folks, and you only have so much money and you only have so many resources, it's critical that you have these stringent processes in place. Now, I do have you as a captive audience. So I'm going to tell you about Ali Daham, who was one of the biggest intentional fraudsters we did catch in Maine. Now, Mr. Daham operated ARAM Grocery, which was a grocery store in downtown Portland, Maine. It was a halal market, so they offered very Middle Eastern type of meats and products, etc. And the FNS, which is an agency within the USDA, qualified them as an international market. Now, generally, I wouldn't talk about food stamps when I'm talking about Medicaid, but the reason it mattered was Ali Daham had figured out that if he declares that he's losing money every year on his taxes, and he got his cousin to falsify his taxes for him, not only could he make a lot more money from his income taxes, he also qualified for every benefit in the state of Maine. So he had Medicaid, he had TANF, he had Section 8 housing, and he was stealing $1.4 million a year in food stamps, from the government. So the reason we found Ali Daham was twofold. One, we had reports of from the community, people saying, "Wow, like this guy is out there buying EBT cards for 50 cents on the dollar." An EBT card is like your benefit card that you can buy food with or withdraw cash from. And secondly, we had data systems that we built from scratch. We had to hire designers and programmers, and we were told that we can't do it. In fact, I'll never forget Xerox, who manages a lot of the data systems in the state of Maine and a lot of the welfare systems in states across the country, threatened us and tried to charge us a bunch of money to build our own system. Well, it's always fun when the governor picks up the phone and calls their the head of the account and says, "I'm going to drop everything I do with you guys unless you do this immediately." So that was helpful, and it did help us find millions of dollars in fraud immediately once we had the data systems all synced up and talking. Now, one of the things I'm supposed to talk about a little bit is our reforms, right? It's easy to just point at problems and say, look, there's welfare fraud and there's Medicaid fraud and people are just stealing from the system. Well, one of the organizations that I work with, Foundation for Government Accountability, Scott Centurino earlier is from there. They openly advocate about ensuring that benefits are going to the truly needy. And there's a couple great policy fixes. One is to enhance the data sharing across programs. So there's almost no excuse for it not to have wage reporting, income data streams, child custody arrangements. All that is actually it's just checkboxes, it's ones and zeros in the cloud now. So having those systems talk and ensuring that the right people are receiving resources, not only does it improve program integrity, but it also improves efficiency, right? You're not dealing with shuffling paperwork anymore and waiting for people to overnight you packages. So that's really important. And one of the reasons it's critically important, and forgive me, but I think this is the right audience, but it's called verified on receipt data. So you can only take action on certain types of data streams according to the federal government, which again, because it's a state-federal partnership that you heard about, you have to listen to them on a lot of these issues. So you can only take action, such as sending that 10-day letter, if you have verified on receipt data. So some of those data streams are VOR data, and you're allowed to just actually turn off benefits without even sending a 10-day letter if you know someone is egregiously, receiving benefits when they can't. And it would also address many of those household composition issues that I had mentioned earlier. But the issue right now is that there's these COVID Medicaid handcuffs. Now, throw a Y in chat if you've heard of this already. Trevor's cheating. I know he knows about this, but so with the COVID, with the COVID-19 emergency, Congress passed a law essentially saying we're going to give states additional money for COVID, reasons, and it's about a 6.5% increase in the amount of money states get. Now, the deal with the states was as long as there is a COVID-19 public health emergency, which is declared by the Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Human Services, as long as that emergency is declared, you cannot remove people from Medicaid rolls. They either have to die or remove themselves through moving and notifying you that they're moving. So this is a major issue right now facing states because they can't clean up their rolls at all. They cannot remove folks that are ineligible. If you started on Medicaid, if you get access to Medicaid because you don't have a job, and then you start making $250,000 a year, you are still legally entitled to keep receiving benefits because they can't remove you. They're not allowed to remove you. You'd have to remove yourself and do the quote unquote right thing, which doesn't happen very often. So that's a challenge we're running into right now across the country. I know that some state governors are very interested in pushing back on that because, as you heard earlier, states are on the hook for about 40% of the cost of Medicaid. I think Scott said 40% of Pennsylvania's budget right now is Medicaid, which is just a staggering number when you look at all the other things that you're supposed to use general fund dollars for. Now, as you can see, these types of these can be very expensive thefts of government resources and benefits that are intended for the truly needy. Healthcare isn't cheap, and it's critical to step up the fight and ensure strong program integrity as a core component of good healthcare. Now, as a lot of you are moving along in your career, there's a ton of options and opportunities to improve healthcare access, outcomes, etc. But I'd like to throw a plug in there to not forget about program integrity and fighting welfare fraud, because it is a critical component and it ensures that the system's fair and people aren't taking advantage of each other. And frankly, I don't think I would have learned so much about the healthcare system if I wasn't working actively to protect it. So I'll stop here for questions. And I want to thank Josh Archambault and all of you for your time.
Thanks, Chase. We appreciate it. That's great and great information and a great topic. Let me throw out a question to start. There is one in the chat that I'll get to, but how do you communicate about this when a governor and an agency decides we're going to get serious on this front? I would imagine that there are special interests and others who might interpret those actions, right, to be picking on providers, right, or picking on those, who are truly in need, and both of which may just be making honest mistakes, and that this is, too aggressive or too heavy a hand from the state for people who simply need help or people trying to help those who need help. So how did you handle as an agency, the communication side of this in terms of talking about what it is that you all are doing, the benefits of it, et cetera?
So it's a really good question, and something that we still face challenges with. No matter how well you message it, at the end of the day, even if someone isn't entitled to Medicaid, or you're taking something away from somebody, right, that they may or may not quote unquote need. But so the way we really talked about it was protecting benefits for the truly needy. Now, people say, oh, that can mean anything. What does that mean? Well, let me give you a concrete example. In Maine, and this is true across the country, there's waiting lists for folks to receive Section 28, Section 23 services, which are, sorry, I dove into my healthcare stuff too quickly, but essentially those are services, in-home services, one-on-one provider services, very expensive and time-consuming services. And those only get a certain amount of funds, right? Because so much is spent on the broader population, and a lot of it is spent on fraud. Now, if we had more resources, we could actually address those wait lists, and people wouldn't be sitting around waiting to get good healthcare treatment, in-home care, et cetera, that has really good outcomes, right? But we're stuck with these wait lists. We're stuck with these difficult situations, and frankly, sometimes we would also put a mirror up to some of those groups that are looking to advocate, right? I call it like the poverty lobby, right? These are folks that they're just opposing it because you haven't changed the system, and we've seen a lot of folks aren't swayed by those types of arguments.
So with respect to that poverty lobby, you just have to fight them most of the time? Are there tactics or strategies to work with them after a certain fraud scheme is proven, for example, and there's a lot of communication on them? Was it your sense that they ever backed off? Talk a little more about that interaction with those special interests.
I wish I could give you a more diplomatic answer. I'm not that guy. I am the person that I think, you want to make sure resources are going to the right people, and you have to fight and have principles about that mission, and not be moved from that path. And there are a lot of ways to compromise. I don't see the other side make any attempt at compromising. In fact, they resort to name calling, or you're killing people, etc. Conversations like that. So I haven't found it very helpful to engage in a quote unquote diplomatic approach. So
yeah. It's an important question. My background in state government, I'd give the same answer. Unfortunately, I think some fights are just righteous fights, and that's what they end up being. So, Lindsay, so we've had a couple of questions submitted. Just remind everyone, if you're submitting questions, submit it to everyone. We've had a couple that were submitted to hosts and panelists only. Let me jump into a couple of them. Here's the first one. Is more being done to ensure that information is shared between agencies to verify custody, et cetera, as you mentioned? If a state wanted to begin working to establish that kind of verification process, who would have the authority to begin making those decisions?
it's a good question, Lindsay. Generally, the authority for data sharing agreements, a lot of the times it's an MOU. Unless it's a specifically protected document or type of data that's confidential or classified specifically by statute, a lot of the times states can share information based on memorandums of understanding between agencies. So we found the most effective way, rather than rushing to and this is from an internal point of view, you need to be in the agency to get an MOU. You're not going to walk in and tell a department, hey, you need to sign an MOU immediately with this people. Like, you can do that, but it's going to take a lot of work and resources and allies. But if you're on the inside, reaching out to your counterpart at, here's an example, BABLO, the Bureau of Alcohol Beverage Lottery Operations. We did not have an MOU with them to determine, for example, who's winning the lottery, right? If you win a $100,000 lottery ticket, BABLO would know, but we wouldn't know at the department that you just had $100,000 come in your pocket. So through a simple MOU, we created a process where that data was immediately shared, and it was cross-checked against our Medicaid rules, and kept that data about the beneficiary private and protected, because that is super confidential.
And Lindsay's got a follow-up here about do these kinds of things, these requirements of data sharing communication, do they require legislation? And I would add to this question, because legislation is very difficult to pass. Is it more a matter of requiring political leadership, the right political leadership or executive leadership, to force agencies to do what they otherwise wouldn't do in this regard? What are your thoughts?
So it does take strong political leadership. to get this done from a lot of different levels, because you're going to hear agency pushback from different directors that have been there forever saying, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. We've never done this before. It's going to cost a ton of money, etc. I could go through the laundry list of excuses that you'll hear every time you want to do anything in state government. That being said, it doesn't take legislation, but if you think you have an opportunity to put advanced legislation to require it, you should. And the reason I say that is many times agencies will say, oh, well, we could just pick up the phone and figure it out for ourselves. Or, oh, we already do that. They give us that information when we need it, right? Well, okay, our solution is going to be legislation requiring that, and you have to give us a quarterly report of how many times you gave one of those transactions over. So it's better to have legislation, but if you can't, work on the MOUs too.
So in your experience investigating Medicaid fraud, how difficult is it to distinguish between sloppy, chaotic, unsophisticated processes or actions taken by providers and true intent to defraud and steal? I mean, is that a real challenge? And I'm assuming you have to deal with those situations. Both are bad, right? They're both a problem for the system, but you have to deal with them in dramatically different ways, proving intent, et cetera. I mean, how hard is that? Knowing that we have so many providers that are, really focused on doing good work without perhaps the accounting sophistication or a lot of the other, back end processes that probably need to be in place when they're handling so much money. So
fraud is very apparent very quickly. Overpayments happen all the time. That's the way it works with any system that's, I forget the number, but it was like, what do we spend? $500 billion a year, $600 billion a year on Medicaid. It's a reimbursement system. So you fill out something and get paid for it. So with a system like that, there are constantly errors about being paid too little or paid too much. Now, the fraud component comes in with intent, and intent comes with patterns and what people do. So if you have one invoice that doesn't sync up with an actual service provided, sure, like that can be a mistake. If you have 1,000 of those and it's millions of dollars, and then there's evidence of you trying to hide it by moving that money from account to account, then it's fraud, and we're going to come get you. And in some of those situations, you bring in the FBI, you bring in the U.S. attorney, the state attorney general's office gets involved very quickly as well, because these are high profile, high dollar amounts. But again, it's usually there's an intent, like you can see it happening. It's very apparent.
What would you say the skills are that are necessary to be a good state official working on healthcare fraud issues? Do you have to be a lawyer? Are there other angles that you can come at this from?
I'd say tenacity. You really can't quit. You're going to be told no basically on everything you or your boss wants to do. So not taking no as an answer is really important, and having a boss that supports you in that, because you're going to be ruffling feathers. You're going to be really trying to change things up. So I don't think you have to be a lawyer. I just think you have to be, have some thick skin. I had numerous people call me, yell at me, call me names. It's tough, but if you're intelligent and you have a kind of an idea of what you want to do and how you want to improve the system, and at the end of the day, you'll get there. Just have to stick it out and work the hard hours.
So those Medicaid fraud units that you talked about in New Mexico, ours was located in the Attorney General's office. Okay. Separately elected official, right, from the governor, which you can imagine how challenging that was for the governor to oversee the health agencies of the state, and a different separate elected official to oversee the Medicaid fraud unit, right?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, are these units located, are they located in government underneath the chief executive of the state? And then, sort of a similar question. When do the feds get involved in these fraud investigations? Because it sounds like, for the most part, what you've mentioned is that this really is state-led investigative work. And isn't some of the type of crime that's being committed here, isn't it really the kind of white-collar crime that the feds generally are very good at investigating?
Yeah, so to your first question, I'm not sure. I've heard a mixture of where it's located. They generally act in concert with the attorney general, no matter what, but because they are such a specialized unit, accessing information and trying to discern intent. So I can't answer that completely. The second component about federal, it usually has to hit a dollar threshold, and sometimes it does matter if it's multi-state. So if it's a provider that is providing, quote unquote, providing services for multiple states, they'll get involved, and generally has to be a lot of money for the feds to get involved and use their resources. Because otherwise, I've sat in those meetings at the U.S. Attorney's Office where they said, this isn't big enough for us. They're like, okay, well, guess I'll come back next year when it's another $1 million. I'm not sure. But that's just another person that says no to you down the road.
Yeah. Did you run into examples of cases that spanned states that were regional operations, or do most fraudsters typically tend to target, the state that they're operating in? And there is a question now: does every state have a fraud unit? Does each state have one?
Every state has a fraud unit. They don't all take things criminal, though. Some states do not actually even prosecute folks for some of their welfare fraud at all. They do everything administratively, which is basically hearings, etc. In terms of multi-state work, I'm not sure. I think in some of the bigger states, that's probably much bigger issue. Generally, the providers that are committing fraud are smaller. They are not the big conglomerates. They're not national hospital systems. They are not large organizations. They are these stand up quick criminal elements is what we've found, and they're pretty effective at getting their way.
Well, wonderful, Chase. Really appreciate you talking to us today. I think everybody on this meeting did not expect perhaps this morning to come learn as much as they did today about Medicaid fraud, but it's very important, and we appreciate having you as a partner and all the work that you've done and that you do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.